The night John Lennon's life was taken, the world felt a jolt like electricity hitting calm water. People remember where they stood, who they were with, and the strange quiet that settled in afterward. Millions mourn the loss of a dreamer who once imagined a world with no borders and no fear. But for three men, that night carried a weight no headline or candlelight vigil could ever capture. Paul, George, and Ringo weren't just former bandmates. They were brothers forged in cramped vans, hotel hallways drowning in screaming fans, and studios where magic felt so normal they didn't realize they were changing history in real time. And suddenly, one of them was gone. The world looked straight to the Beatles, hungry for answers, emotion, a statement, anything. People expected heartfelt speeches and dramatic tears. But grief rarely performs on command, and the surviving Beatles handled the tragedy in ways that were complex, imperfect, and human. The shock cracked old wounds open. Regrets surged like tidal waves. Public misunderstandings erupted instantly, while private heartbreak happened behind closed doors where cameras couldn't intrude. This isn't just a story about mourning. It's a story about unfinished conversations, fractured friendships, fleeting reunions, and the cruel reality that sometimes there isn't another chance to say what you meant to say. The world lost John Lennon that night, but Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr lost something deeper: the possibility of one more laugh, one more heated argument that ended in music, one more memory together. And over the years, the truth slowly surfaced piece by piece through songs, interviews, and quiet confessions. Their reactions weren't polished or perfect. They weren't meant to be. They were raw, confusing, emotional, and sometimes misunderstood, just like grief itself. So what really happened in those first hours, days, and years after Lennon's death? How did each Beatle cope? And what secrets still hide between the notes? The answers reveal more than history. They reveal the fragile threads between the world's most legendary band and the moment it became three instead of four. And it all begins with the shock that stopped music itself. The night unfolded like a nightmare, someone left unpaused. New York was humming with its usual rhythm when news broke that Lennon had been struck down outside the Dakota. Radios tripped over the announcement, broadcasters' voices cracked, fans froze like statues in the middle of sidewalks. Calls rippled across the world. Lennon is gone, not sick, not retired, gone. For most people, grief arrived through screens and headlines. But for the Beatles, it entered like a ghost tearing through history. In a moment, decades of memories crashed into the present. Hamburg clubs stained with cigarette smoke. Long sessions at Abbey Road where laughter shot through the room faster than guitar riffs. Fights, reconciliations, and the complicated brotherhood they never fully understood until it was broken. Their phones rang deep into the night. Managers, reporters, friends, strangers. Everyone wanted a comment, a reaction, something quotable. But how do you react when part of your life has been ripped out in the middle of a normal evening? Silence felt safer. Silence felt like the only thing that made sense. Meanwhile, the world began piecing together details. The assailant, the location, the senselessness of it all. People gathered outside the Dakota, not knowing what to do except stand there. They brought flowers, candles, silent prayers. Some cried openly, others stared, stunned. Lennon wasn't just a star, he was a voice that told people they weren't crazy for wanting peace in a world that glorified conflict. And somewhere across the ocean, former bandmates listened to the radio just like everyone else. Only the grief cut deeper. The Beatles were always bigger than music, but at their core, they were just four boys who once believed the world couldn't touch them. Fame didn't protect them now. Nothing could. But that wasn't the whole story. The world wanted emotional clarity. Instead, it got confusion. And when Paul spoke first, the reaction wasn't sympathy. It was shock of a different kind. Paul McCartney walked out of a recording studio in London the day after Lennon's passing, face pale, voice strained. Cameras surged toward him in a blur of flashes and questions. And in that chaotic moment he muttered, "It's a drag." Two simple words, instantly dissected, replayed, weaponized by headlines. People wanted poetic grief, but what they saw sounded flat, cold, disconnected. Critics pounced. Fans felt confused. How could the man who harmonized beside John through adolescence, fame, and musical revolution react like that? Had their friendship soured beyond repair? Was their bitterness left unresolved? In truth, shock doesn't always dress itself in eloquence. Sometimes it shows up numb and clumsy. Paul later explained he was shattered, exhausted, and overwhelmed. He'd been in the studio trying to distract himself, pretending life was normal because the alternative was unbearable. Cameras caught him moments after holding back tears, not moments after rehearsing a statement. And grief doesn't care about good PR. Later interviews revealed a different man than the world assumed that day. Paul talked about crying privately, about feeling robbed of time they could have used to fix old wounds. He admitted he'd imagined growing old with John, laughing about the madness of Beatlemania and the fights that once seemed so enormous. He later poured that regret into Here Today, a song shaped like a conversation that never got to happen. Paul wasn't uninterested. He was stunned. Shock can look awkward, and the world isn't kind to awkward grief. But the next Beatle made a very different choice. Rather than stumble through public questions, he got on the first flight he could find, headed straight into the heart of the tragedy, and his reaction showed a side of loyalty and urgency that left fans speechless. When the news hit Ringo's Starr, he didn't freeze or hide behind statements. He booked a flight. No hesitation. No press-polished mourning. Just instinct. Something terrible happened, and someone he loved was hurting. Ringo arrived in New York ready to offer support to Yoko Ono and young Julian Lennon, who lost a father in the most devastating way. Imagine stepping into the home of heartbreak, knowing nothing you say can fix what happened. Ringo wasn't there to solve anything. He wasn't there for cameras. He came because grief demands presence more than words. Stories later whispered that he walked into a room where silence felt heavy enough to crush the air. Julian reportedly broke down when he saw him. Ringo didn't try to be a hero. He just stayed, listened, held space. This wasn't a PR moment. This was family instinct awakening. The world sometimes sees Ringo as the fun, light-hearted Beatle, but in that moment, he was the anchor. No microphones, no awkward sound bites, just quiet loyalty in a storm of confusion. Later, Ringo would admit that he never truly processed Lennon's passing for years. He kept moving, touring, performing, pretending rhythm could drown sorrow. But certain interviews decades later show tears slipping through cracks in his voice when John's name comes up. It never stopped hurting. The world saw Paul stumble verbally. They saw Ringo rush physically. But the next reaction came in a different form entirely. George Harrison didn't rush to cameras or airports. He turned inward, and his grief came out quietly, wrapped in spiritual reflection and fear that fame carried a darker price than anyone could have predicted. George Harrison released a somber statement. John and I had our differences, but they were insignificant next to the joy and laughter we shared. It was gentle, reflective, but beneath it sat a chilling undercurrent. George couldn't ignore the violence. He spoke about the fragility of life, the danger of obsession, the fear that being famous meant walking with a target. And it wasn't paranoia. George himself survived a terrifying home attack years later. He understood all too well that fame wasn't protection. Sometimes it was a magnet for those chasing shadows. His grief didn't blast through press lines like Ringo's, nor stumble publicly like Paul's. George mourned in private, behind spiritual practice and meditation. He'd always been the quiet one, the seeker, the soul trying to look past the noise. But even mystical calm couldn't soften this blow. Losing John wasn't just losing a bandmate. It was losing a brother who'd shaped the early universe of his life. Months later, George funneled sorrow into All Those Years Ago, a bittersweet tribute echoing their shared history. It wasn't sentimental fluff, it was layered: love, regret, nostalgia, and pain woven into melody. A reminder that even when friendships bend, their history doesn't break. Rumors lingered for years about tension between George and John. People whispered about old arguments, egos, and unresolved emotions. But loss has a way of dissolving bitterness. Whatever wounds existed, grief made them irrelevant. There was affection beneath it all, even if they didn't always know how to express it. And as George retreated into quiet mourning, the world turned to Yoko and the fans, expecting public closure. But what came next surprised everyone. Nothing fuels speculation like silence. And in the absence of a neat emotional narrative, fans began asking painful questions. Were John and Paul reconciling before that night? Were George and John planning another musical moment? Did the Beatles secretly reconnect? Truth rarely fits fan fiction perfectly. But hints existed. Paul had visited John in New York years earlier, one last casual hang filled with jokes and music talk. Not a grand reunion, just two old friends rediscovering something comfortable. Still, the public imagined fireworks that never fully happened, so grief twisted into regret. Fans wanted clarity. But reconciliation isn't dramatic. It happens in small bursts: a phone call, a shared joke, a gentle shift from anger toward understanding. Lennon once said in interviews that he still loved Paul, no matter what history printed. Paul later admitted he never stopped loving John either. And then there were the unsaid things. Lennon and Harrison had complicated creative dynamics, sparks of tension mixed with respect. Ringo always stayed in the middle, the quiet heartbeat trying to keep peace. They were a family, and like most families, they didn't solve every argument in time. The tragedy froze those unfinished bridges in place. No apologies could be spoken, no final laughs could patch the cracks. And maybe that's why the surviving Beatles carried the loss so differently. It wasn't just death. It was emotional suspense, cut short without closure. But while fans demanded answers, Yoko took control of the public moment, and her decision shaped how the world mourned next. When someone so influential leaves the world suddenly, fans expect a public farewell, a grand funeral, a cathedral filled with music, crowds singing in unity. But Yoko Ono made a different choice. She asked fans not to gather in sorrow around John's body. No spectacle, no ceremony swollen with tears and flashbulbs. Instead, she urged quiet reflection, a moment of global silence rather than public theater. It surprised many. Some felt confused. Others respected the intimacy. For the Beatles, it meant honoring grief privately. No cameras capturing their pain, no forced composure. Yoko guarded Lennon's memory fiercely, choosing dignity over performance. Fans still flocked to Strawberry Fields and the Dakota gates, placing flowers, handwritten notes, and vinyl sleeves like offerings. Strangers hugged in the cold. Radios played Imagine on loop until it felt like a prayer. Even without a formal gathering, the world created its own memorial. Lennon had always inspired emotion, so his passing naturally shaped a global pause. And so, each Beatle mourned in his own corner of the world, scattered but united in heartbreak. No staged reunions, no symbolic photo op, just grief moving quietly, the way deep pain often does. It wasn't over, though. Time didn't dull their loss. Instead, it reshaped it into something permanent, echoing through the music that followed and the rare, vulnerable moments when they dared speak about him. In the months and years that followed, sorrow didn't fade. It transformed. Paul sat with the weight of things left unsaid until the emotions spilled into "Here Today," a tender confession disguised as song. He imagined a conversation with John, one he wished he could have had when it mattered. Every chord felt like a memory unfolding. George honored him too, adding layers of reflection in "all those years ago." It wasn't sentimental nostalgia, it was acknowledgement. They were kids who built an empire by accident, and nothing could erase that bond. Ringo, resilient and soft-hearted, continued to speak of John with warmth and occasional tears. Time didn't numb him. It just taught him how to carry the ache. Interviews across decades revealed subtle truths. Moments when voices cracked. Glances downward when John's name surfaced. Love never vanished. It just lived differently. And while conspiracy theorists spun tales about secret Beatles reunions or dramatic final conversations, the real story was simpler and more human. The surviving Beatles loved John deeply, and losing him carved a permanent space in their hearts. They honored him not with grand gestures, but with music, subtle tributes, and honest grief. John Lennon once sang that life is what happens while you're busy making other plans. And for the Beatles, that line became prophecy. They thought there would be time. Time to laugh at old arguments. Time to reminisce about the madness they survived. Time to simply exist together again without pressure or cameras. That future vanished in a single moment. The world lost a visionary. But Paul, George, and Ringo lost the person who shared the beginning of everything. Their reactions weren't perfect. They were real, messy, human. A rushed flight, a clumsy sentence, a quiet prayer. Not dramatic enough for headlines, but exactly right for people caught off guard by grief. In the end, their music carried what words couldn't. Their silence spoke where interviews failed. Brotherhood doesn't disappear. It evolves, especially when someone leaves too soon. And maybe the most haunting part of this story isn't the tragedy itself, but the reminder that even legends don't get unlimited time. The Beatles taught the world to dream. Losing John taught them something far harsher. Some goodbyes arrive without warning, and the only thing left is how you remember. So here's the question that lingers. Did the world ever truly understand the bond between the four men who changed music forever? Or is that connection something only they could feel? What we know is simple. They were brothers once. In music, in chaos, in youth, and in loss. And in every note they left behind, John is still there.